Tuesday morning, protesters clashed with federal officers outside Bro-Tex, trying to stop what they believe was an ICE raid.
America, we just witnessed one of the most chaotic immigration enforcement operations in recent memory when federal agents raided Bro-Tex manufacturing in St. Paul, Minnesota, and professional protesters immediately swarmed the scene to physically block ICE vehicles from leaving. 14 people were detained in what authorities called a federal criminal investigation. But instead of letting law enforcement do their job, hundreds of activists formed human chains, blocking federal vehicles and got themselves pepper sprayed and tear gassed. But here's what's absolutely ridiculous. One activist complained it's not fun to get hit with pepper spray. Well, no crap. Maybe you shouldn't be interfering with federal immigration enforcement operations.
The second time in less than a week, federal law enforcement officers swarmed an area in St. Paul, once again clashing with protesters.
What is up, guys? TYSON DELACRUZ here. Thank you so much for rocking with me. This case perfectly shows how organized activist groups have turned immigration enforcement into an absolute circus, where professional protesters think they can physically obstruct federal agents with impunity. Let me break down exactly what happened at Bro-Tex, a paper manufacturing facility in St. Paul. Federal agents from ICE, FBI, DEA, and Homeland Security investigations executed a that's the key word there, court-authorized search warrant as part of what they called a federal criminal investigation.
A chaotic scene this morning outside a St. Paul business after an apparent raid by federal agents. Hundreds of protesters gathered at the scene, growing increasingly agitated. Federal agents wearing Homeland Security and Drug Enforcement Agency vests held them back. At one point, the agents used mace to control some of the people in that crowd.
According to the Department of Homeland Security, agents detained 14 people on alleged immigration violations. One of those detained had past domestic abuse charges, and the other had allegedly illegal re-entered the United States. This wasn't some random sweep. This was a targeted operation based on specific intelligence about criminal activity.
Emotions reaching a boiling point as hundreds of protesters clashed with federal agents this morning outside of Bro-Tex paper manufacturing facility in St. Paul.
I just think it's an atrocity to be removing people from their families.
But instead of allowing federal agents to conduct their lawful operations, hundreds of protesters immediately descended on the scene and began physically obstructing law enforcement. They formed human chains, blocking federal vehicles from leaving, and created a dangerous situation that forced agents to use tear gas and pepper spray to maintain control. These activist groups keep using the word peaceful to describe their actions, but standing in front of a federal vehicle and physically blocking immigration enforcement is not peaceful. It is obstruction of justice. When you interfere with federal agents conducting a lawful operation, you are committing a crime.
I had a person peacefully documenting and recording who texted me and said, "It's not fun to get hit with pepper spray. I learned what it's like to get tear gassed." Folks that were there peacefully documenting that were forcefully assaulted and shoved by officers.
Listen to this activist complaining, "It is not fun to get hit with pepper spray. I learned what it's like to get tear gassed." Well, no kidding, Mr. Activist. Maybe if you weren't interfering with federal law enforcement operations, you wouldn't have gotten pepper sprayed. These people act like they're victims when they're the ones creating the dangerous situations.
We saw somebody with an ICE vest, Homeland Security. We also saw U.S. Marshals, and doing crowd control is St. Paul Police. So you can see that there is a large group of protesters that are shouting at both the local and federal law enforcement officials that are here on scene.
I've said it before and I'll say it again and I'll say it till I'm blue in the face. These protesters do not have jobs. Their job is simply to protest. That is their job. How else do you explain hundreds of people showing up within hours of a federal operation? These are professional activists who monitor police scanners and social media to mobilize whenever immigration enforcement happens. Of course, we've got the predictable sob story from family members claiming their relatives were just hardworking people who did nothing wrong. One woman called an activist saying, "This was my dad. That was my uncle."
And she called me and she said, "That was my dad, and that was my uncle."
We stand with families.
We stand with families. And she was brave enough to put that trust in our hands, and we were able to connect her with our legal supports and our legal partners.
Well, maybe you should have helped them get their immigration status right instead of expecting them to work illegally without consequences. If your dad and your uncle were in this country illegally, that is not ICE's fault. That's their choice to violate federal immigration law.
They keep doing this, they're going to be breaking apart lots of families, and they'll see the outcome of what they've done. What they're truly taking away.
These family members act like immigration enforcement is some kind of surprise. If you're in this country illegally, you know there's always a risk of deportation. The solution isn't to have activists block federal agents. The solution is to follow immigration law in the first place. What's particularly interesting about these scenes, many of these protesters are still wearing masks. Why are some of these people still covering their faces? The pandemic is over, but these activists are still hiding their identities while interfering with federal law enforcement.
This is obviously not America.
In a statement, ICE says this raid was, quote, court-authorized law enforcement activity and served a search warrant in furtherance of a federal criminal investigation. Mayor Melvin Carter says St. Paul Police was not involved in any way, and his office had no prior knowledge of the raid.
We work hard to make sure that folks know that our St. Paul police officers are not and will not ever be ICE agents. That's not the work that we do.
Mayor Melvin Carter immediately distanced himself from this operation, saying St. Paul police weren't involved and had no prior knowledge. He emphasized that St. Paul police officers are not and will never be ICE agents. This is exactly the kind of sanctuary city nonsense that creates these problems in the first place. When local officials refuse to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement, it forces ICE to conduct operations like this without local support, which makes everything more dangerous and chaotic. The Bro-Tex facility features a mural honoring migrants, which tells you everything you need to know about the company's attitude towards immigration law. This wasn't some random target. This was a business that was so apparently employing people who weren't authorized to work in the United States.
Everything you are, you carry with you everywhere you go.
Pablo Calaca says immigration is a core part of who he is. An artist drawing on his experiences in South America, Europe, and now Minnesota.
My favorite part in this mural, the faces.
This is one of his most recent pieces in St. Paul, depicting a mother carrying her child, looking for a way across a border. With them, a backpack filled with the essentials and the intangibles.
What are you carrying in your bag? Your life, your house, your home, your past, and your background, your cultural background.
Listen to what State Representative Lee Finke had to say about this operation. Mind you, this is the same person who advocates for bodily autonomy, trans rights, climate justice, and tree coverage. Basically, every progressive cause you can imagine. These people see immigration enforcement as just another social justice issue to protest.
The owners of this building welcome this project, this portrait of immigrant safety and travel.
The artist who painted this mural said what happened broke his heart and emphasized these are human beings as you and me with kids just trying to pass a wall and have a life. But here's the thing, there are legal ways to immigrate to America. When you bypass those legal processes, there are consequences. What happened in St. Paul wasn't spontaneous community outrage. This was an organized response by professional activist networks that monitor immigration enforcement and mobilize protests to interfere with federal operations.
I stand here in front of you as a refugee who came to this country, as somebody who has stood up to defend our undocumented communities and received huge backlash for wanting to make sure that they had the health care that they deserved. And now to sit here as the mayor-elect and watch this happen and unfold in our city, I want you all to know that I am standing with you, not as somebody who is in government, but as somebody who is from an impacted community.
The future mayor of St. Paul spoke at a rally and said, as someone who came to this country as a refugee and has stood up to defend our undocumented communities, she positioned herself not as a government official, but as someone from an impacted community. This, my friends, is the problem. When you elect officials who see themselves as advocates for illegal immigrants rather than enforcing federal law, you get chaos like what happened in St. Paul.
We know that at least two, multiple people were taken into custody by both federal and local law enforcement during the protests. That was why they were taken into custody, that our photojournalist David Peterlin saw that with his own eyes.
They arrested one guy when he was going to work, before they went in the house. Yeah, it's insane. It's insane. You know, if they're criminals, I can see it. If they're doing bad, yeah. But if they're making a living, man, leave them alone.
These networks have communication systems, legal support teams, and trained constitutional observers who show up to document and interfere with law enforcement. They call it constitutional observation, but it's really organized obstruction of federal agents trying to enforce immigration law. When protesters physically block federal vehicles to interfere with law enforcement operations, there are real consequences. Federal agents had to use tear gas and pepper spray because these activists created a dangerous situation that could have resulted in some serious injuries.
But of course, people are on high alert in the community. A lot of neighbors have come over to see what's been going on. We know Melvin Carter, St. Paul mayor, was here as well. He was talking to members of his own department. We heard a little bit of that conversation, just overheard him talking to St. Paul police, asking them a little more about just what they were doing here. Of course, they cannot enforce federal immigration law. They are just here strictly for crowd control.
The activists complain about getting pepper sprayed, but they created the situation that would require crowd control measures. When you physically obstruct federal agents, you're not a peaceful protester. You are interfering with law enforcement, and there are consequences for that.
Protesters spilled into this neighborhood on the east side of St. Paul Tuesday morning.
They started in that house,
where they shouted at federal agents carrying out an investigation inside a home.
These activists continue to call immigration enforcement an assault on our community and claim federal agents use chemical weapons against Minnesotans. This is the kind of inflammatory rhetoric that turns routine law enforcement into dangerous confrontation. America, what happened in St. Paul perfectly illustrates how professional activists networks have turned immigration enforcement into a dangerous circus. When federal agents try to conduct lawful operations, hundreds of protesters immediately mobilize to physically obstruct law enforcement. These aren't concerned community members. These are professional protesters whose sole job is to interfere with federal immigration enforcement. The fact that they show up within hours with organized legal support and communication networks proves this is a coordinated response. The complaint about getting pepper sprayed is absolutely ridiculous. If you don't want to get pepper sprayed, don't physically block federal vehicles and interfere with law enforcement operations. It's that simple. The family members crying about their relatives being detained should have helped them get their immigration status right instead of expecting them to work illegally without consequences. Immigration law exists for a reason, and violating it has consequences. Mayor Carter's refusal to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement creates exactly these kinds of dangerous situations. When local officials won't work with ICE, it forces federal agents to conduct operations without local support, making everything and everyone more chaotic. The mural honoring migrants at Bro-Tex tells you everything you need to know about why this business was targeted. Companies that openly celebrate employing people without work authorization shouldn't be surprised when federal agents show up with search warrants. 14 people were detained in this operation, including somebody with domestic abuse charges and another who illegally re-entered the country. This wasn't some random sweep. This was targeted enforcement based on specific criminal activity. The professional protesters can complain all they want about getting tear gassed, but when you interfere with federal law enforcement, there are consequences. Maybe next time you'll think twice before physically obstructing ICE operations. Let me know what you think about this. Drop it down in the comment section down below. Smash the like button if you kindly would. Share, subscribe, and as always, guys, I'll catch you on the next one.